The Subaru station wagon you see in front of you is not a Levorg, not in Australia, it's the WRX Sportswagon. It's been rebadged for our market to give it some of the allure that the WRX badge has in Australia. Now, even though this is the first WRX on the Subaru new global architecture and the Impreza debuted on that in 2017, if you think it looks a bit like an Impreza and smells a bit like an Impreza, then you'd be correct, because it essentially is an Impreza under the skin, although it is a different car, as we shall discover when we go through it. The difference in wheelbase is only 5mm, so that's really kind of up to wheel positioning and suspension tuning and stuff. It's 26-75mm in this generation, shared with the sedan and the Sportwagon, which is 25mm more than before. If you think that this WRX Sportwagon has a bit of the flavour of a Levorg, well then you'd be correct, because it is very much an evolution of that car from before. If this is meant to be a radical departure, then that's just marketing waffle, because it's not. It is actually just an evolution of the previous model. At the front, it isn't anywhere near as outlandish as the WRX sedan. It doesn't have the big air intakes. It doesn't have the plastic wheel arch cladding, and it doesn't have the black alloy wheels, which are ½ inch wider and wear 245mm tyres. They're only 225 on the Sportwagon, so it is more of a demure looking car. This and the entry-level model, which are called WRX Sportswagon and WRX GT Sportswagon, which is this car we see right here, both share these 5-spoke 18-inch alloys. The model at the top is called TS. It's also a model in the WRX sedan. It adds multi-spoke wheels and adaptive dampers and a few other things we shall discover as we go through it. But generally, there's only $2,500 difference in recommended retail between the GT and the TS. So maybe the TS would be the better one to choose, but I still think that this GT does have a level of appeal. Whether you think that it has that visually, that's up to you. It definitely has smaller mirrors than before, so it doesn't look as Gumby as the old sort of originally 2014 onwards generation that it supersedes. It doesn't have the wheel arch cladding, which people might really like, because that is a love it or hate it thing about the WRX sedan. This is 30mm narrower because it doesn't have those things along the side. But generally, the styling of it is sort of fairly cohesive without being necessarily classy. This is not the Liberty of the 2000s. This is not a revived Liberty GT Spec B, and I suppose all of us who loved that era of Subarus probably still hanker for that to come back, and this isn't quite that, certainly not visually, but it is still a good car and a big car. It's 4,755mm long, which means that this is in medium-sized territory, even though it's essentially based on a small car. Now, while the cynics among us would say that this WRX Sportwagon is just an Impreza in drag, a 5-year-old Impreza in drag, mind you, it's not. It actually is more than that. It has an aluminium bonnet, aluminium front mudguards. It has a strengthened inner frame. So in terms of stiffness compared to the previous WRX, that was already a development over the Impreza anyway. It has 14% more rigidity in the front flexing. It has a 28% stronger body for torsional stiffness, and yet it has a development of the previous suspension. So we're talking McPherson strut type front, double wishbone, independent back, and a sort of more of a focus on being a supple performance car, as we shall discover when we drive it. Now, where the Impreza connections disappear for the WRX is inside. This is very much an evolution of the aesthetic of the Outback rather than the one that's present in the Impreza and the Forester, which has been around since 2017, 2018 anyway, so see you later. This is newer and better. The 11.6-inch portrait touchscreen in here is better positioned than in the Outback. I think it looks a little bit more vertical. It doesn't have all of the USB-C and the auxiliary and the 12-volt outlet all bunched in together at the bottom. It doesn't have wireless charging either, but certainly not in this spec, or certainly in the one above it actually, but it's still easier to navigate, I think. There are physical buttons here for the ventilation up and down, but you can push down in the bottom and bring it up here and have the main thing controllable through various bits and pieces. But it does take a little bit of acclimatization to work to, and it does take a little bit to connect to Apple CarPlay or Android Auto when you plug it in through the cord, which you need to do. Now, this GT version here is on the drive-away price, just under $6,000 more than the entry-level Sportwagon. The entry-level Sportwagon starts at about $55,200 drive-away in Australia. This is just over $61,000 drive-away, and then there's the TS above that, that's sort of in the 64s. What this GT brings over the standard car is a bunch of useful things, I think. This sunroof is tiny, but at least it has a sunroof. It has this really nice sort of perforated leather accented trim with red stitching on it. 8-way electric front adjustment for both front driver and passenger, plus seat heating for the outboard rear seats. We also have a surround view monitor here with this little camera here that you press, and it shows you the view of the side of the car near the wheels, and it gives you a view of the front of it when it, so you can see through the front with a camera, which is kind of nice. We also get front and rear windscreen de-icers. We get auto dimming rear view mirrors outside and inside, and just a couple of extra safety bits and pieces. But generally the rest of it is the same as the normal Sportwagon, and that means really quite well equipped, I think. The stereo connected to the 11.6-inch touchscreen is only 6 speakers in this GT, and it's only 6 speakers in the model above it. It doesn't get the 10-speaker Harman Kardon version that the TS sedan gets, which is a bit of a shame because it'd be nice to have a wagon with the best sound. It sounds pretty good, but not amazing. It is a little bit digital. The bass is reasonable, but it's still not as kind of warm and as analog as any audiophile would like. As we go through the rest of the interior, this sort of padded section on the dash here with this horizontal red stitching, these nice sort of little metal infillets or metallicized infillets in the ventilation bits here, vertical here, horizontal on the outside, look really quite nice. I don't mind having analog instruments at all. I think they look really good. Got a little 4.2-inch screen in the middle there that does scroll through with these little information buttons on the wheel here. The steering wheel isn't the STI spec wheel that the TS adds. That adds STI branded instruments, an STI branded steering wheel, ultra suede seats, a couple of those multi-spoke wheels, but is mainly about having drive modes and the adaptive dampers. That's all just a little bit of extra garnish on this. As for the quality of the everything inside here, it really is pretty nice. It sort of has that robustness that Subarus have had for a long time, but it does have a little bit of a sheen about it. The top of the dash here is a little bit squidgy. The top of the doors slightly less so. The door armrests are really nicely padded. You can just squeeze this 1 litre cavi bottle in the door, although it's kind of incidental. It doesn't, actually no, it just went in, but I reckon it'd scratch after a while. As for the driving position and just general feel of it, having these extra little windows here on the side does add a level of vision. The smaller mirrors are much nicer than the old Dumbo ears of the last model. I think they look a lot classier. And there's just sort of a nicely cohesive feeling sitting in here. This is not a, like German premium level, but it's not premium either, if you get what I mean. It's actually nicely made, cleverly put together, and not too overcomplex, unlike a lot of the safety systems, which is probably one thing I should add at the end. You've got to hit this car button here to bring up vehicle control, driving assistance, speed assistance, and other. If you want to turn the lane assist off, you go to driving assistance. You have lane departure prevention function. You click on that, and whatever you choose, although it has gone back to all functions, I had chosen just lane so it wouldn't have the steering assist, which is really quite snatch and grab. It's just a bit too much. You can program that stuff in there, but it is rather overzealous in the way that it reacts, certainly in terms of noticing road furniture. And in this model, it has a driver alert. So if you're looking at this huge portrait touchscreen and faffing about with that, it'll beep you and say eyes on the road, but then you're just trying to work the car. So, you know, you can ignore it after a while, and thankfully you can turn much of it off. Now there's probably 3 surprise and delight things in the back of the WRX Sportwagon I wasn't expecting. One of them is this. You've got auto up down windows, but the rear windows with privacy glass in this go all the way down, which is awesome. People like that, even though they probably don't use it very often. The other is that both of the front headrests are multi-adjustable. They go in 5 positions and go click, 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 click all the way forward, which is also nice. And unlike the Impreza, the WRX Sportwagon has the same trim on the back doors as it does in the front. So this is very slightly squidgy. This slightly rough-edged carbon fibre S trim is the same as in the front The door armrests are just as well padded with the same red stitching and all that sort of stuff. And like the front, unfortunately, this canning bottle doesn't quite fit in the door. In both cases, the shape of the speaker and the armrest is like that, and Subaru wants you to put in the bottle like that. It's madness. You could get that in there if they'd actually done it a bit smarter, but it's vertical, so that's just a fail in my opinion. As for the rest of the back seat in here, it's actually really good. This is room personified. My knees are so far from the front seat here. I've still got toe room under a seat that's all the way down the bottom. I'm nicely deep dished in the seat here, so it's not too deep. I'm not sitting too splay-legged. It's kind of a nice compromise between both. Again, elevated above both front seats, which can both be dropped, so there's height adjustment there. It's all nice and even. Here with the sunroof, I've still got this much headroom here, and yet sitting in the middle, even though this position is not cushy like these outer two here, again with the same upholstery as in the front, unlike a Golf R, this position is hard, but it's still kind of okay. And you're not touching the headlining either. There's a slight reduction in headroom, but here we've got the slope on the side from where the sunroof finishes. So it's fine for me at 5'10", probably good for someone just over 6 foot, at which point you'd have a really good view, but yeah. In the center here, we have a pair of air vents, but we don't have temperature control. We do have two 2.1 amp USB-A chargers with this weird cover that'll fall off over time probably. Two setting outside seat heaters for the outboard seats. We've got a pair of mat pockets. We've got a bit of a transmission tunnel lump here, but not too intrusive in terms of putting your feet on either side. And we've got sort of carpeted floor mats in here with red stitching around the outside to match what's on the seats. So it's all pretty good, I reckon. In the center here, we've got an armrest with piano black around a pair of cup holders, which nicely matches here. But we also can do this in this sort of 40-20-40. We can drop the middle down for skis and stuff through the middle because we're in an all-wheel drive WRX Sportswagon, and that's the sort of stuff people want in a vehicle like this. Now, the main reason you would buy this car is right next to me. It's the fact it's a wagon. It's called WRX Sportswagon, and we love sporting wagons here at Chasing Cars, and clearly a lot of other people do too, hence why there are 3 models. This is the mid-spec GT, but if you bought the TS above it, you would have different rear tailpipe outlets with an STI logo on them, but the same engine, so whatever. This GT, which is the mid-spec of the wagons, also brings an electric tailgate. It's meant to be hands-free, but I cannot work out how to work it. I think it was wave your hand around the badge or something to make it do that. It's meant to open in 4.7 seconds, which is quite quick. And in here, we have 492 litres below the luggage cover, which is pretty good. Underneath the luggage cover here, we have a kind of full-size spare. It's a Steely 205/50/17. Whether that's the same rolling circumference or not, it actually says temporary only, but it does look cool. I think I'd want to have 4 of those on the car at some point. We've got this adjustable luggage cover here that'll even sit in place. Fold the back seat flat, which you can do by pulling these little levers on either side, and it goes actually dead flat, 909 litres with that down below the window line, 1430 to the ceiling. So all of that is not only roomier than the WRX sedan, but also way more practical. The combined fuel consumption figure for the Subaru WRX Sportswagon is 8.5 litres per 100 kilometres using 95 octane premium unleaded. The warranty for Subaru in Australia is 5 years or unlimited kilometres, whereas the scheduled servicing for this car is now 12 months or 15,000 kilometres, with the 5-year cap price servicing totalling $2,366. Now, some of the criticism levelled at the new generation WRX has been at its drivetrain, which means a re-engineered FA24 2.4 litre direct injection turbo flat 4 that only has 5 kilowatts more than the old 2 litre at 5,600 RPM, and that is 202 kilowatts. The torque is the same, 350 Newton meters, but from 2,000 RPM to 5,200 RPM. So that's a very broad spread, and that pretty much shows what the engine feels like on the road. It really is quite strong. We do have 3 modes on the steering wheel here. I was in intelligent, then I'm now in sport, which makes the throttle perkier. You can instantly feel that mid-range torque. It's so much better than before, I think. It just makes the car a little bit more effortless, which is kind of the point of having a big capacity engine. And then what we come to is the dynamics. Now, with the CVT, you would think and not the adaptive dampers in this GT version, you can be forgiven for thinking that it would be Snoozeville, and I don't really think that it is. I think the harder that you drive it, the better that this car gets. It is quite soft at times, certainly when you start driving it around town. Your initial perception of this WRX GT Sportwagon is smooth and torquey, and that doesn't sound like something I particularly want in my WRX, but I think that underneath all of that stuff, in fact I know underneath all that stuff, is quite a fun performance car. The engine is strong, and mixed with this CVT that's been re-engineered, it means that as you go up the modes from Sport that we're in now to Sport Plus, you add Sport Plus and it goes from a D symbol to a number, so you're actually using gears rather than using the CVT, although most of the time all of them do that anyway. It feels like you're sitting behind a torque converter automatic, and when you're hammering into corners under brakes in Sport Sharp, it actually down changes and rev matches, which is way better than all the rubbish that CVTs have done in the past to try and mimic the transmission that they're not. So thank God for that, because it makes up for the fact that the Wagon isn't available in a manual, and it makes the automatic so much more livable. Speaking of livable is the ride. We are in a car without adaptive dampers. You can hear the lane departure beeping in the background because I've got the steering assist turned off. It's probably not as well controlled as it could be. There is a few moments where you wish the body control was a little bit tighter, but for the most part, I think the ride of this GT Sportwagon is so supple, especially when you're hammering it hard over bumpy roads. Sometimes it will bottom out. Most of the time it doesn't. It just kind of fits the mood of the vehicle mostly. I haven't driven the adaptive dampers, so I don't know how much better they are than this one, but there's quite a lot of goodness going on in here. I know that the transmission in itself is a much faster shift and much faster in downshifting when it's in manual mode than the old CVT, and that just blends with the general handling of this WRX Sportwagon. It does gain some meat in the steering when you hit Sport Sharp. If you go back into Intelligent, which is the normal mode that it defaults to every time you start up, it's light. It is really quite quick, so there's instant response either side of straight ahead, but not necessarily feel. The steering is quick though, it's 2.5 turns lock to lock, and it does turn in really nicely. Other people have criticised this WRX Sportwagon, aka Levorg, for understeering a bit in corners, and at times you can feel that there's an understeering sort of bent to it. It doesn't really have that moment of poise and just sort of modest driving, but when you up the pace and you start to use the balance and the nuance of the dynamics, you can feel that double wishbone back end, squat down, help the nose point in, just have a general kind of extra dimension to the handling that really does make it quite a fun car to drive. In fact, surprisingly fun. Would the GT Sportwagon benefit from a little bit more damping resistance? I think so, but just a modest amount, not a whole lot. I think if you wanted that though, you just spend $2,500 more and buy the TS version, not this GT version. Because for people who buy this car and don't need the extra STI garnishes and the fancy exhausts, which only look fancy, and the adaptive dampers, then this is probably all the WRX Sportwagon they need. Given that Subaru doesn't do an Impreza wagon and doesn't do a Liberty wagon anymore, I feel like this has a very large element of Liberty GT wagon built into the renamed Levorg, aka WRX Sportwagon. And that is not a criticism. It actually is quite a good car. It is a basis for making something probably a bit better if you wanted to modify it, but there is a real likability about this vehicle and just a kind of a all-round cohesiveness that may not shout its credentials, but I think that the deeper that you dig, the more impressive it becomes. There's been quite a bit of criticism about Subaru in Australia renaming the Levorg the WRX Sportwagon, and up until now I kind of agreed. To me it looked like a Levorg, not a WRX wagon, but after having driven it I actually like it a lot more than I thought I would. the general charge for the 3 models in the Sportwagon lineup is $1,000 more than the WRX sedan that's underneath. There are 2 more WRX models, but they're both manuals, and they sit a couple of grand below this mid-spec GT, and then one that's $44,990 before on-road costs, so a stripper manual, if you will. All of the models don't have adaptive dampers except for the top 2 TS variants, and I suppose that's where we get to here. This is only $2,500 cheaper than the TS, so are you losing out a lot by not having the adaptive dampers? I suspect, based on other people's opinions, yes, but if you're buying this sort of wagon to be a smooth and refined thing that's also pointy and sharp and can be really driven quite hard and is quick and drivable and comfortable and useful, then I kind of feel like it's already nailing the brief. Is it the most attractive wagon in the world? No. Look at that. It's not really everyone's cup of tea, but you could always buy it in black, and that would sort of dull that down a bit. And you can easily change those wheels if you don't like those either. So if you don't like the exhaust, you can add an aftermarket exhaust. It's a Subaru. The world is your oyster when it comes to that sort of stuff. But as for the basics and as for the general sporting appeal of the car, I think that the WRX Sportwagon, even in GT form, is much better than people give it credit for. If you haven't subscribed, please do so below the video. Hit the notification bell and tell us what you think about renaming the Levorg the WRX Sportwagon, or this GT spec without adaptive dampers, or about chasing cars. Thanks for watching.